Hey, everybody, this is John Sherwood. Welcome to the Unpolished Church podcast. If you're new here to this podcast, thanks so much for joining us. It's glad to have you. And we just ask that you like and subscribe. Please share this with anybody you feel it might be beneficial for, as we here on this podcast are trying to equip and resource people toward a more simple and authentic way of being the church. Today, I have the great privilege of actually talking with one of our own here in our microchurch expression, Martha Brown, who has been a part of big church and in leadership and was an elder's wife for many years, several decades before being here and becoming part of this microchurch network with us. And so I'm excited to dive in with her as she kind of discusses a little bit about her journey, what it's been like for her being a part of these microchurch expressions, the good, the bad, and the ugly, how that compares and contrasts with other forms of church that she's been a part of. And hopefully this can be helpful for any of you out there that are also looking to experience a simpler form of church and more authentic intimacy with God and with other believers. Let's dive in. Martha Brown, thank you so much for joining us here on Unpolished. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having me, John. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you. So you are a part of our microchurch network here locally in the Asheville area. Mm-hmm. And you have been journeying with us since before I arrived 7 or so years ago. And actually, we're a part of the leadership team that brought me here. So let's just start there. Any regrets?
No regrets. No regrets.
Oh, great. I'll pay you later. But no, seriously, right? Like in all seriousness, I'm sure that you had no idea then where we would be now or what we would be talking about right now, right?
So that's right.
Reflect back on that for a minute. Just talk about that journey as you look back and as you kind of experience, wow, I could never have predicted this 7 years ago, because I probably couldn't have either, right? So just reflect back on that for a minute for the audience. Just what's it been like as you take a high level flyover of this transition from, kind of traditional church model into what we're doing now?
Yeah, you're right. No regrets, John. I know when we did go through the process of meeting you and bringing you on board, one of the things I said was, things are going to change around here, but I didn't know in what direction.
Hopefully for the better. Hopefully for the better.
I'm like, yeah, this is going to be different. Yeah, I think, so much has happened over especially the last 5 years, especially beginning with COVID and all the impacts that had on church gatherings and on our lives in general, that I think where we are now seems like, to me, a natural growth from that experience of being at home or being in smaller groups and getting used to that. I think it helped me transition because it necessitated that change. So, yeah, I'm very happy with where we are now. I think it's not always easy. I think the fact that we did it gradually helped me to adapt and adjust. And I think others have said the same thing.
Yeah, for sure. We've talked about that on other episodes where the pacing of change, I think, was, looking back, like probably helpful for a lot of people. And it was way slower than I wanted it to be. And so God in his providential wisdom surrounded me with some people that kind of helped to, I think, pace that differently than I would have on my own. And that was for the better. And just to clarify too, like just for the audience who doesn't know, obviously, you were a part of the leadership team that hired me and brought me here, but then not long after that, God kind of moved you in a different direction, and you haven't been a part of the leadership since that time, since early on, and haven't really had the most intimate front row seat in the decision making and all the inner workings of this transition. You've been a little bit more kind of on the receiving end of that, like the vast majority of people in the group. And so maybe talk about that a little bit, just obviously coming from big church expressions, being involved in leadership, like being kind of in the know, in the inner circles, to over the last several years in the midst of a lot of really significant transition, not only in our church expression, but also in the world at large, and in the church, you haven't had that intimate, seat on the bus, if you will, in the decision-making rooms. Like, how have you experienced that? Has that been like really joyous and refreshing? Have you missed that and like felt like, oh, I'm really longing for that? Like, how have you felt as you know, God has kind of navigated you in and out of some of these decision-making circles in church context? How do you compare and contrast them, you know, and just talk about that for a minute?
There have been times when I have missed having a front row seat. There have been times when I had a bit of FOMO of what am I missing? I don't know what I'm missing. Should I be missing something? There's also a sense of relief, time to catch my breath, time to focus on my own walk with God. I think I've observed a lot from this perspective. And one of the things that I've observed is that the leaders have been very gracious and kind people, and people that I felt I could trust, not just the leadership overall of the church, but the microchurch pastors that we fellowship with. I just see such a quality of faith and character in their lives that I didn't feel unsettled because I could see their example and I could see that they were getting the nurturing and the training that they needed to feel confident to do this role. I think the concept was hard for me to grasp of what microchurches are, and it took doing it, and I guess it's still morphing into newer things all the time. But I think it took being a part of it for me to understand. Yeah, thanks, John, to understand what is John talking about, because it's not something I had done before, and the closest paradigm I had was like a house church or a home Bible study group. So I didn't quite get the concept, and I think maybe I have the concept now.
Right.
But we'll see. It'll change before that.
We've talked about that quite a bit too, of just how this is so hard to like describe, or it's so difficult to anticipate until you just are experiencing it. You have to really touch it and taste it and experience it to have a frame of reference. Like, and obviously I think to some degree that's true, obviously, of everything, but even more so, I think, with this, because it is something that is so kind of foreign. It is so unlike our experiential frames of reference that we kind of think, oh, I think it's going to be like this, or I think these will be the advantages and disadvantages. And then you get into it and you're like, oh, like, actually, it's probably very little of what I thought it was going to be. Maybe you could talk about that for a minute, like in what ways were you anticipating microchurches and experiencing that? And in what ways have those anticipations like been confirmed or maybe just blown up out of the water? You just talk about that a little bit of like kind of leading into this, what you were expecting and thinking. And then now looking back after several years, like how do you compare and contrast? If you were talking, another way to put it maybe is if you were talking to someone else who's not here with us, and they're like maybe exploring or thinking about, or some crazy cockamamie leader around them is exploring or thinking about moving into some sort of microchurch type expression, like what would you tell them, and how would you communicate your own journey from, kind of completely outside this frame of context and experience to now having some years of experience behind you?
I would say that my expectation was this will be what we've done before, but just with a different name. And I'll give it some time and see if it's not that. But that's really the only thing I know to expect from this. And so what I have seen over time is a more autonomous group, a more all that church is just in a small setting. I love that we're not autonomous, that we're still tied to the bigger body, to the other groups, and to the leadership. I think that we need the guidance and the direction from that, and that there's a lot of resources there that I don't want to lose my connection to, a lot of people that I love. But I think this has become more of a lifestyle. I thought about the rhythms that we used to have of, you go to big church meetings, you come home, you go back to another meeting, you come home, you go about your life. And it felt sort of asynchronous to me. And so as I've experienced this over time, this feels more like living my life in a more harmonious and synchronous way with other people that are part of my life. I have more time. I think one of the things that I saw in myself was that when you have big church, and I'm going to get, I guess, away from your question, but the way we traditionally did things, there were a lot of roles built into that just to keep the thing running, even things like making the coffee or setting up the chairs. And so when you take those things away, you find that you have more time. And for me, we live about half an hour away from where we meet in Asheville. So I'm not on the road as much. I'm more connected to people here. So I think for me, I had to deal with, wow, I'm not feeling as valuable because I'm not as busy and I don't have as many demands on me. So that means I don't quite know who I am in this new setting. So I've tried to be more intentional about the time that I have and putting a focus more on relationships and redirecting that time and that energy into getting with people and building relationships. So I think that's what I've seen is just more of a being more part of a family of believers that I can really know me and that I feel safe with. And that didn't happen right away. It takes time to feel safe with people. It takes time to build trust. And it's a leap of faith to put that commitment in up front to say, I don't know you all very well, but I'm willing to commit to you to be part of this with you. And I hope you're not too crazy. So
Yes. Only by the blood of Jesus can such things happen. That's right. It's funny when you mentioned that. That was really beautiful, and I think well said. You talked about making the coffee, right? Putting out the chairs, all the things that it takes. I just recently had a conversation with a good pastor friend of mine who leads a traditional church, and they just went through the arduous and faith demanding process of purchasing land and buying a building. And obviously we've kind of gone in a very different direction, but it was something that they really believed they were being led by Jesus to do, and amen and kudos to that. And I know, Jesus uses all kinds of expressions and modalities of his body to accomplish his works. But one thing he said stuck out to me. He said, yeah, now that we've got this building, we're really having to communicate to everyone, this is y'all's building. We need people to now make the coffee and set up the chairs and mow the lawn and all of the things, right? And how demanding that is. And the thought just came into my mind of okay, that is a certain paradigm, that is a certain perspective and viewpoint of okay, we want to tie up the Christians' time, energy, money, and schedules to, and I was I think that for me, I feel a bit more persuaded. That's understated. I feel extremely more persuaded that just as you said, for your time to not have to be into those endeavors, but perhaps be able to be perhaps more directly involved, right, with the mission of Jesus in the world, which has, I think, less to do with chairs and coffee and more to do with the Imago Dei, with people, with the hurting, the suffering, the needy amongst us, to learn how to love people, even though they might be crazy, right? And even though they might think that we're crazy, that is the mission, the redemptive new creation project. of Jesus in the world. I am convinced. And so these structures and these like methodologies and modalities, from my role, I'm trying to consider how can we like free people up to at least be in a position to perhaps do that better. Obviously, each one of us is going to have to take responsibility for what we do with our 24 hours in our day, and our physical and mental abilities and limits and all of those things. But yeah, I think that was very much in view for me over this journey of like, I think someone said, I think another pastor on the show has recently said, like, we can church ourselves to death. And that phrase stuck with me. And that also kind of like rang true as you were talking of like, yeah, we go to the big church meeting and then we have another meeting. And then there's a phone call about the meeting that we just had. And then there's a meeting that really should have been an email, but it was still a meeting, and it's like we church ourselves to death sometimes. And, and it's again, I think it's all like really well intended. And I think it's all really well meaning for the purposes of God. But those can be some of the detriments and some of the like the sticking points, I think, of some of these types of modalities and expressions. So you mentioned having a safe place, and I know I've spoken on here on the show before. I remember a conversation with Steve Staten who talked about that and his house church experience and expression that he's had more recently over the last 4 or 5 years, after being a big church pastor for his whole career. And one of the things that he talked about was this idea of healing and safety, and it being a place that provides a different environment, than what he was used to. And you kind of mentioned something along those lines. And so I'd love to just invite you to share a bit more about that, about how have you experienced the microchurch expression to be a place of greater intimacy or healing or safety? Like, what has that been like for you? What's been the challenges? What's been the beauty? And everything in between?
I think it comes with time. I think it is a leap of faith in the beginning. And for me, the safety has come in watching people live out their struggles and walk their faith. We have people who have had health challenges, relationship challenges, financial challenge, all kinds of struggles that we go through. And to see people walk that in faith and talk about their struggles and be open to the vulnerability that being in a group like this requires of us has made me feel safe because I know them at a deeper level. I could see when we would go to big church, people singing songs or people smiling and hugging, but I didn't know what was really going on in their lives like I do now. And they know what's going on in my life a lot better than they did before. They're still here. But, I feel like I have a safety net in my life that when hard times come, when I have a bad day, that there are people who care for me and know me and are willing to give me a lot of grace. I'll tear up as I say that, but that grace is so powerful and we need to experience it to really believe it's there for us. And big church can wow us. And I think I always made a lot of assumptions about people when I would see them singing or see who they are when they're there at the building. Like they don't have any problems in their life. It's easy for them to sing or to stand up and pray. But this has made it more real to me that all of us have to live by faith, that all of us have to push through, that we need each other to encourage each other through all of it. And our particular group has a prayer thread that on GroupMe that there's constant prayer requests coming through for ourselves, for other people that we know. And I've seen just incredible things happen through those prayers and the connections that we have too, of knowing what we need to pray for one another. So I think that builds safety for me of we're in this together. We're not going to abandon each other. We're not going to gossip about each other. I don't think. We're gonna.
Well,
We're gonna.
and if you do, you have opportunities to work through it,
That's
and yeah,
right.
yeah.
That's right. I think about Ephesians 4, about bearing with one another in love, and in First Thessalonians about showing hospitality to one another. And what a great climate this is to practice those things and to see what those things really mean in day-to-day life.
Mm.
So,
You mentioned your prayer group in your microchurch. I believe it's a group of, a bit more senior ladies, and that
mhm.
prayer group is legendary in the network. So I just want y'all to
Yeah.
know
Yeah.
your
Mhm.
intense, committed, covenanted prayer chain group that you guys have, man. It is a thing of
Mhm.
legend amongst other groups, and something that we're all
Yeah.
aspiring to. So that's amazing.
Oh,
So
yeah.
what about some of the challenges that you find of that kind of
Mm.
community, right? Where you are known and able to know in much greater degrees than other settings, but that's not all good. That's
Mhm.
not all
No.
sunshine and rainbows, as they say. Maybe talk about that for a minute. What has
Mhm.
been, some of the challenges, maybe some that you would expect and are perhaps a bit obvious, and maybe some that aren't.
Yeah. I talked about having my illusions of people when I would see them in big church and how their lives seemed perfect. And I think seeing some of the problems that we have and some of the things that happen can be disillusioning. It can be like, wow, I thought we were all in this for, um, I don't know, an easy life. I don't really think that, but I think seeing, wow, the pain can be hard to see. The pain, the disappointments that we witness, the discouragements that it's like the scripture that says, rejoice with those that rejoice and weep with those that weep. I don't always want to weep with those that weep. I really just want to go be happy. And so I think that's a high calling, to invest your emotions into the well-being of other people and be willing to weep with them and ask them to weep with me, and to reveal things about myself that I'm uncomfortable revealing, to people. It's not easy. And I think, of course, we have conflict. I think we bring into the group maybe unresolved hurts from our past. I think sometimes we project onto each other things that we haven't resolved, and we have to talk through it. And we had to learn to talk through it, because we always like to encourage each other and say, "Oh, you look great today," um, but to say, "I think you're getting off topic here," it's a little bit harder. You can say that to me as I go here. But, but so I think having more honest and transparent conversations is hard. I think sometimes we let each other down. I let people down. I've missed a few weeks here recently, and one of the sisters that I love so much, she called me up and she said, "Are you dead?" So I'm like, "No, I'm not. Just mostly dead. I'm not totally dead." So, but I don't know. And I know sometimes I let people down, and that's hard. Um, yeah, I think sometimes we sing off key. we,
Right.
sometimes I don't like our songs, but you get that. You get that everywhere.
Right. Yeah,
Um,
you definitely get
mhm,
that
mhm.
consumer experience stripped away to a much greater degree. And
Uh,
I do feel like I want to speak here for a moment, because I think this is something that's really like important and central to this whole idea of what Unpolished Church is trying to do, the podcast, what we're doing here in our expression, et cetera, is that, I think for so many, I would say perhaps the vast majority, Christianity is a consumer experience at its root. And unfortunately, I think there are all kinds of ways that that's perpetuated and encouraged, even without knowing. And as by way of example, there's a couple who's been coming with us for a while in the microchurch that I've been a part of, and they were coming from another sort of traditional church expression, and after some time, quite some time of being in the group, but kind of still just really only coming to some things and really not investing in others. And they've decided, hey, we want to kind of go back to, this bigger church expression for songs that are more on key more often, or whatever, a children's ministry that isn't just so ragamuffin, or, whatever the rationale and reasons are. And, a part of me, my heart breaks because it is, I think, missing out on so much of the beauty and the difficulty of the way of the cross of Jesus. The world will know that you are mine if you love one another, and how we are so often lulled to spiritual sleep as we make these assumptions, standing in big church, singing with smiles on, but not knowing anyone, no one knowing us, and not actually walking the way of Jesus in any real meaningful way with anyone else, even those inside our own home sometimes. And I just, my heart breaks because I think it's such just an aberration of the gospel and of what Jesus came to die to create a way forward, died to create the ability for the walls of hostility to be torn down and the two become one, even in the midst of great difficulty, off-key singing, hurt feelings, disappointments, right? Like, Jesus came to bring the Gentiles and Jews together, Paul would say, and there was such schism and animosity between those two ethnic groups. And for me, I just think I'm seeing more and more that the gospel message is more about our human relationships being reconciled not only to God, but to one another, and how we have systems that actually hamper us from doing that. They encourage us to just sit shoulder to shoulder next to someone. I've used the movie theater reference before. It's like we're in a movie theater of church, but we don't really experience the image of God in other people in any real way. Why? Because it hurts. It is hard. It is the way of the cross, that love does suffer. And so I'm up here on my soapbox now preaching. And so I apologize, but you got me fired up with what you were saying, Martha. And it's hard. And listen, I'm not, I don't want to come across haughty or proud or like I don't got some plank in my eye. Like, listen, I struggle too. You know what I mean? This very week I was struggling to love some of my brothers and sisters. I felt wronged by them, and I felt hurt, and I felt dismissed and canceled. And I was like, Jesus, just call down fire, like just burn them up.
Yeah.
Oh man. And Jesus is like, really? What about you? How about your heart, bro? And I was like, well, dang, Jesus. All right, fine. So yeah,
I know. Yeah. And what you just said made me think. I've been doing some journaling about this, trying to prepare my heart for this conversation. And one of the things I was reflecting on is how much pressure is put on the leader of the church to inspire people. And that we come in the traditional model, we come week after week and we look for that soundbite, and we look for that one thing that's our inspiration that we can take with us and live through that week with. And then we come back for another hit the following week. And so it puts so much, just getting my hit, man. And yeah. So I think it's a terrible amount of pressure and an expectation to put on a leader. And I think that's one of the reasons that churches seem to have a pattern to me of looking for really charismatic personalities for leadership roles, and that can be very dangerous, I think. And so what I've seen, you talked about the image of God in every person. And what I've seen in a microchurch expression is that seeing that image of God in these ordinary people as they live their lives day in and day out is so inspiring. I've learned things about what people go through and have overcome that inspires me more than words can say. They inspire me to persevere. They inspire me to love and to serve. And I'm just gobsmacked sometimes at the commitment to love that people have, and what a great beneficiary I am of that humble kind of love. And so the inspiration that I draw from that I mean, you inspired me, Jon, don't get me wrong. but it's more of a sustaining inspiration. It's not something I have to come back and get a hit from. I see these things day in and day out with the people that we're with that move me so much. And, even with a couple that leads our microchurch, they love with such sincerity and such humility. And I'm just awed by them and so grateful that they're in my life. And I wouldn't have known that about them if they weren't in the setting, I think, and put in a place where they've had an opportunity to show that. So I'm very grateful.
Yeah, maybe you can just talk about that a little bit further and elaborate a bit more on the idea of leadership, in these different expressions and modalities. Like obviously we're very familiar with the celebrity pastor dynamic. And I think there's a growing swath of people that are very disillusioned and fed up with the celebrity pastor fallout and the just very inherent risks and dangers that can occur in those models when you have too much power and too few hands with too few guardrails. Like all of us can be corrupted. The enemy prowls around. And I think there's been so much of that's gone on over the last couple of decades in such public spheres now because of the connection of the globe with the internet and everything else. Like every Christian is seeing every pastor fallout, whereas in times past that probably was still happening, but fewer people knew about it. Right. And I think it is scarring. I think it's scarring the psyche and the spirit of the Christian community. And I know, we've talked in past episodes here about some of the opportunities that exist specifically with leadership in this like decentralized, not platformed, very organic kind of, for lack of a better word, like ugly and just unpolished way, right? Like yeah. So I don't know, maybe I could invite you to just talk a little bit about that. Cause especially, you have been in roles of prominent leadership, you and your husband in big churches for probably the vast majority of your Christian experience. And so you've seen kind of multiple angles, and I'd love for you to maybe dive into that a little bit and what some of the pros and cons, compare and contrast, these leadership opportunities and modalities and these different expressions.
It's a subject that is very dear to my heart. I will start by saying that I definitely think there's a place for strong leadership in the church, for educated leadership in the church, for courageous leadership at the helm. I think that in small group expressions, we need to be inspired still. We're not like completely autonomous and out there adrift. So we need a higher call, and we need that. But what I have seen has been just an opening up of space for so many types of gifts to be used and so many types of people to use their gifts. I think it's wonderful that people who are quiet and introverted can serve as pastors. You don't have to be some flamboyant speaker, but that you really are looking at people who have the character of Jesus to fill these roles and not CEO abilities. And I think for many, many years, churches that I've been part of looked for CEO type people to step into leadership rather than maybe more servant hearted, quiet Jesus followers who loved people deeply. So I think the spectrum of gifts is able to shine, and that makes the whole body a lot more healthy when all those gifts are being used. I mentioned, the leaders of our group and how I don't think they ever they moved up here, and I don't think they ever expected to be in this role. But boy, they're knocking it out of the park just by loving people and just being there for people. And so I think just, I love that. I know one dear friend I have told me that she never wanted to leave Asheville because she loves serving in this role as a microchurch pastor. And it feels like it's her calling. So, that just delights my soul to know that all kinds of gifts are welcome and valued.
Mm. Yeah, I obviously know the microchurch pastors of the group that you're in very well, and they for 30 plus years in other big church contexts had never led anything formally ever in
Right.
any church. Not a Bible study, not a home group, not a small thing, nothing, never. And they came here, and after some time being here, we started discussing them potentially pastoring a group, and you talk about deer in headlights, man. They were like, what are you talking about? But coming back to your point about like the goalpost shifting from charisma, outward abilities of speaking, typically, like, the stereotype. I barely even need
Oh, yeah.
to describe it, for
Right.
people. But yeah, the like strong, boisterous, loud, usually good looking, attractive, high
Of
power,
course.
doesn't
Yeah.
need much sleep type of person,
That's right.
um, but
Mhm.
it's interesting because when you compare that to what I'm thinking of Peter in particular and Paul in the New Testament, as they describe the roles of leadership and the presbytos, the episcopos, the elders, often in English there, the diakonos, the leaders of the church, every time they're instructing about those things, it is always about someone's character. And it never has anything to do with their like abilities other than the ability to be transformed into the likeness of Jesus. And how easy it is to get off track and to be wooed by the wrong things. I think of First Samuel, right, where it says that God doesn't look at the things man looks at. And how it's so alluring for all of us, right? And I was weaned in an environment like that. I know it well. and and I could play that role in that context, but what if I'm not transforming more into the likeness of Jesus? Well, at worst, potentially I'm just a puppet of the evil one, right? And that is so scary and dangerous and sobering, right? And for me, I had pushed against this podcast even starting for years, because I was like, I'm not trying to create a platform. Like, that's dangerous. First of all, I don't know that we have anything meaningful to say anyways, just because we don't know anything. And I don't know that that's really fundamentally changed, but I always want to be careful, that like really what I'm aiming at is not a platform. It's not celebrity. It's not my metrics growing on Spotify or YouTube or whatever, but that my character is becoming more and more like Jesus in the quiet moments that very few people see, with my wife, with my children, with a small micro church of people that I'm trying to share my life with. And just what a backwards way that is. Like, that is an upside down way to the world. And so, yeah, as we are like kind of continuing this dialogue about, micro churches and trying to lean into some of these ideas of gift-based ministry and understanding leadership in a different way than the world does, right? And all of this, like, what else comes to your mind as you're reflecting on your 3, 4, 5 years experience now in this micro church expression? Like, what else rises to the surface for you that you would want to talk about?
Well, I've just seen so much growth, not only in our leaders, in our microchurch pastors, and the support and the training and the nurturing that they get, but I've seen so much growth in the group, in our ability to kind of, I don't know, regulate ourselves. There was one time, like every group, there's probably people who like to talk and people who don't, and want to sit on the sidelines. And I remember one time we really had to practice bringing everybody into the conversation. And there was this thing we used to do with our kids at the dinner table where we would pass the spoon, and if you didn't have the spoon, you couldn't talk. And so we actually did that in one of our microchurch meetings where we had like a ball or something, and if you didn't have it, you couldn't talk. And it was just good practice for us because we realized, oh, this person never got to talk. So here's the thing, and now they have to talk. So that was good, and we only did that once or twice, and we kind of started getting in the rhythm of it more. But we just learned more, I think, to draw each other out and to listen better. I think that we've learned that we are accountable for our own spiritual growth, and like, it's not going to hear a prominent speaker give you a soundbite, but it's, what are you doing that you can bring to the group? What have you learned this week? What's moved your heart this week? How can you encourage the group? And I think we're growing in that. And that's a joy to see. I think we're growing in our trust of one another. I think the maturing is a beautiful thing to see, and the accountability, not in a negative sense, but it's just us here. It's we're going to make this good, or it's not going to be good, and we all have to bring our hearts to it and our vulnerability to it so that it's meaningful.
So what do you think, as we get ready to kind of bring the plane in for a landing here on this conversation, like, what do you think are some of the ways that microchurch expressions can be relevant today in our cultural context? Obviously, as you mentioned earlier, COVID, I think in some very significant ways shifted our cultural context. And I think some of those shifts have diminished. I know there's been a huge resurgence of like large companies like cutting remote work and like kind of forcing people back into brick and mortar buildings, which is like a rebounding effect from some of that COVID shift. And I think the US government recently had a huge shift in that regard for their employees. And so, I think that there is still sort of this like reverberating effect of like how we're still being impacted and responding to the COVID event. But yeah, I think that was a pretty, I think everybody would feel safe to say that was like a pretty significant like flag in human history and in American culture, especially. And so, as you think about like what relevance does microchurch have now for us in America?
Yeah, starting with the COVID example, I know people, and I know churches I've been a part of where people just didn't come back, and they had a chance to stop the rhythm through COVID and all that required of us. And they said, this isn't providing what I thought it was for me. And I think I'm going to go it on my own, which makes me sad because we need each other. But at the same time, I kind of get it. Like all that dressing that goes with big church, is it worth giving up more time with my family to go do that? I don't know. I don't think it is, So I think a lot of people weighed that out and decided, I'm going to find something different. And then I think there's been a lot of social unrest. Obviously, I'm not gifted in perception to be able to tell that. But there's just been a lot of social unrest, I think, going back to George Floyd and before that and since that. And now there's so much political polarization in the world. And I think people are afraid. I was afraid, of a big church. I don't want to go where I have to walk on eggshells with people. I don't want to go where we can't talk about what's real or where I'm going to be expected to conform to the culture of the big church. I think big churches are very powerful things. I think you alluded to that earlier. These charismatic leaders can create great danger in the world, that people follow that, they get their identity from that. And I think when you're part of that, you're uneasy. You like, what do these people believe? How do these people believe that faith intersects with the world that we live in? We can't really talk about it because we might offend somebody. So I think being in a smaller setting means it's still hard to talk about it, but you can talk about it. And it means that there's not a big, powerful culture that you have to conform to, or you just don't feel like you belong. I think there's room for diversity. There's room for exploration and curiosity and challenging the status quo, and that there's not that gravitational pull toward the status quo because the group is smaller, and the forces of gravity aren't so strong to pull you toward the center, that you can still have your own thoughts and be your own person, that striving to be led by the Spirit of God. And wrestling with what the Spirit of God is telling you to do in this setting, in this time in history. So I think there's greater freedom there. And with the grace that we're learning to give each other, I think there's more room to express that diversity. And that is much more relevant, I think, for this time. And I think the noise and the tension in the world today, I know it had me wanting something smaller and quieter and safer for me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting that you use that gravity metaphor because obviously we've talked about, we've used this well metaphor as opposed to fences, right? Being drawn to the well of Jesus, kind of riffing off of John 4 and the woman at the well. But I like that gravity metaphor too. In fact, a friend of mine, Megan Larissa Good, wrote a book recently called Divine Gravity. And it's that concept actually that you were just mentioning of like, what is it that like kind of brings us together, that keeps us coming back, whether it's a well or a gravitational center of mass or however you want to think about it. But as you said, ideally, hopefully we're striving toward it being the person of Jesus and his Spirit, right? And not just our shared political identities or non-political identities or our shared the things that the gravities that the world revolve around. I was talking with my wife last night. We got home with our two small boys at like 10 o'clock because of baseball. And we're doing baseball for the first time in the local setting. And I'm like, never again, because the gravity, the center of gravity is so strong. Like these families are out there like 5-6 times a week, sometimes till 10 o'clock at night with young children. Like it is. And I'm like, they are committed and dedicated, man, for the game of baseball with their little ones, 99.99% of which will never play professional baseball and probably not even college.
Tell them. Don't tell them.
Don't burst their bubble. And then I said to my wife, I said, babe, what if we could get Christians to do something together 6 times a week? Like, I was like, that would be the day, boy. Wow. And it just was so starkly contrasting to me, the level of commitment and dedication, the covenanting together as a community that people share around a hobby. Right. And yet the blood of Jesus, the death and resurrection of the Son of God, we can struggle to allow that gravity to have any real mass in our lives that calls us to that same kind of dedication and commitment and covenanting with other people. And I was honestly like, wow, man, the world can have all kinds of centers of gravity that can be very strong. And, I hope that, as you mentioned, that we can allow Jesus as believers to be our centers of gravity that put us in covenanting, dedicated relationships with other people around us. Maybe even until 10 o'clock at night, like my kids' baseball game. Oh man. Wow. So yeah, and then they've got one has a practice, and then there's a double header for the other one all on Saturday. It's like 8 hours of baseball. I'm like, what are we doing? This is crazy. But they love it and they're having fun, and we're trying to make the best of it. But it is
It's
demanding.
not
It is
forever.
demanding. Yeah, it's not forever. And of course, we're trying to lean into like, how can we bring the gravity of Jesus to this place? And
Right.
we're trying to navigate that, of course. But that's
Mhm.
not the said purpose of why
Yeah.
those kids and those families are gathering. So we're kind of trying to enjoy. We're bringing honestly like a conflict of gravitational forces, to say, hey, like
Mhm.
Jesus is actually even more important than this. What would that look like and mean for our lives? And I
Yeah.
think that there's a lot of good, healthy kingdom of God work things to do there, because obviously the kingdom of Jesus is infiltrating all nooks and crannies of humanity, including kids baseball. But but
That's
it just
right.
resonated with me as you said that, that there's these like forces of gravity that can draw us in, and to be careful about which gravitational forces we allow ourselves to be pulled by. So, Martha, thank you so much for the time being here. Thank you for your wisdom and grace as always. And we look forward to being able to continue in this journey together.
Thank you so much, John.
All right. We'll talk to you next time.
Okay. Bye.